You want $899 to touch my engine?" CEO mocked him. Then everything changed. "Before we begin, I want you to imagine something. Imagine you spent 20 years mastering a skill. 20 years of grease-stained hands, sleepless nights, missed birthdays, and endless sacrifices. Imagine knowing your craft so well that you can hear a machine running and instantly tell what's wrong with it. Now imagine someone looking you in the eye and laughing at your price. Not because you were wrong, not because your work wasn't valuable, but because they believed your experience was worth nothing. What would you do? And more importantly, what would happen when they discover the truth? Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't really about engines. It's about value, respect, and the lesson that changed an entire company forever. And if stories like this inspire you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every subscription helps us bring you more powerful stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Now let's begin. The morning sun reflected off the glass walls of Titan Dynamics, one of the largest manufacturing companies in the country. The building stood like a monument to success. Hundreds of employees entered through the revolving doors every day. Millions of dollars flowed through the company every month. Its CEO, Richard Stanton, was known throughout the industry as a brilliant businessman. At least that's what people said. Richard was intelligent, driven, ambitious, but he also had a dangerous weakness. He believed money could solve every problem. And because of that, he often underestimated people whose value couldn't be measured on a spreadsheet. That weakness would soon cost him dearly. It began on a Tuesday morning. Production had suddenly stopped. A massive industrial engine that powered the company's primary manufacturing line had shut down without warning. The machine was enormous. It weighed several tons and was responsible for nearly 60% of the factory's output. Every hour it remained inactive cost the company tens of thousands of dollars. Engineers rushed to diagnose the issue. Technicians worked nonstop. Consultants were called. But nobody could find the problem. The machine looked perfectly normal. No obvious damage. No broken parts. No warning signals. Yet it refused to start. By noon, panic was spreading. By evening, executives were gathering in emergency meetings. And by the second day, losses had already exceeded $500,000. Richard Stanton was furious. "How can none of you figure this out?" he shouted during a meeting. The room fell silent. Nobody had an answer. Finally, one senior engineer spoke carefully. "There is one person we could call." Richard crossed his arms. "Who?" The engineer hesitated. "Frank Miller." Several older employees exchanged knowing looks. Frank Miller had once been legendary in the industry. For decades, he had repaired complex industrial systems that others couldn't understand. Factories across the country called him when every other expert failed. He wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. But among mechanics and engineers, his reputation was almost mythical. Richard frowned. "A retired mechanic?" The engineer nodded. "Yes." Richard laughed. "We have an entire team of engineers with advanced degrees. And your solution is an old mechanic?" Nobody responded, because deep down they knew something Richard didn't. Frank had solved impossible problems before. Finally, Richard agreed. "Fine, call him." The next morning, a dusty pickup truck rolled into the company parking lot. Employees watched curiously. Out stepped a man in his late 60s. Gray hair, weathered face, simple work clothes. Nothing about him looked extraordinary. Richard met him near the production floor. This was his first mistake. He judged Frank within seconds. Frank listened quietly as engineers explained the situation. Then he asked only one question. "Can I see the engine?" They led him inside. The enormous machine towered over everyone. Frank didn't rush. He didn't pull out expensive equipment. He didn't ask for technical reports. Instead, he slowly walked around the engine, listening, observing, thinking. For nearly an hour, he said nothing. Employees watched in confusion. Some wondered if he'd lost his touch. Others questioned whether he'd ever had it. Then Frank stopped. He reached into a small toolbox, pulled out a marker, placed a tiny X on one section of the engine. Then he looked at the maintenance crew. "Open that panel." They did. Frank pointed to a specific component. Tighten that connection. The crew exchanged skeptical glances, but they followed instructions. The adjustment took less than 5 minutes. Frank stepped back. Now start it. Silence filled the room. The operator pressed the ignition controls. The machine rumbled, shook, then roared to life. Instantly, perfectly, the entire factory erupted with applause. Employees cheered. Managers stared in disbelief. The production line restarted. Millions of dollars in operations resumed. A problem that had baffled experts for days had been solved in less than an hour. But the most important part of the story was still ahead. Frank smiled politely, then handed Richard an invoice. Richard looked down. His smile vanished. The invoice read, Diagnostic and Repair Service, $899. Richard blinked, then laughed. You want $899 for that. Frank remained calm. Richard shook the paper. You walked around for an hour, made one mark, and told someone to tighten a connection. A few executives chuckled nervously. Richard continued, $899? That's ridiculous. The room grew uncomfortable. Frank simply stood there, patient, silent. Richard handed back the invoice. I'll pay $20. That's more than enough for 5 minutes of work. The factory floor became quiet. Everyone watched. Frank took the invoice, folded it carefully, placed it back into his pocket, then looked Richard directly in the eyes. For the first time all day, his expression changed. Not angry, not offended, just disappointed. He nodded slowly, if that's what you believe. Then he turned and walked away. No argument, no shouting, no complaints, just silence. And somehow, that silence felt heavier than any insult. The next few weeks seemed normal. Production continued. Profits recovered. Executives forgot about the incident. Richard certainly did. But life has a way of teaching lessons when people refuse to learn them voluntarily. 3 months later, disaster struck again. The same manufacturing system failed. This time the shutdown was worse. Production stopped completely. Every hour drained money. Engineers scrambled. Consultants returned. Specialists flew in from different states. Days passed. No solution. Then weeks. Losses climbed into the millions. Frustration became desperation. Finally, one executive suggested calling Frank again. Richard reluctantly agreed. The company contacted him. The response surprised everyone. Frank politely declined. The executive called again. Frank declined again. Finally, Richard called personally. Frank, we need your help. A long pause followed. Then Frank asked a simple question. Why? Richard was confused. What do you mean? Frank's voice remained calm. The last time I helped, you told me my knowledge wasn't worth paying for. Richard had no answer, because for the first time, he realized the problem wasn't mechanical. It was personal. Eventually, after several conversations, Frank agreed to visit, but only under one condition. Richard had to meet him alone before discussing the machine. The CEO agreed. The following afternoon, Richard drove to Frank's small workshop on the edge of town. The place was modest, old tools, simple equipment, nothing impressive. Yet as Richard looked around, he noticed photographs covering the walls. Factories, power plants, industrial facilities, thousands of workers. Each picture represented a problem Frank had solved. Each represented livelihoods protected, businesses saved, families supported, decades of invisible contributions. Frank handed Richard a cup of coffee. Neither man spoke immediately. Finally, Frank broke the silence. Do you know why I charged $899? Richard shook his head. Frank smiled gently. The mark on the engine cost $1. Richard looked confused. Frank continued. Knowing where to place it cost $898. The words hung in the air. Simple, yet devastatingly powerful. For the first time, Richard truly understood. He had been measuring effort, not expertise. Minutes, not decades. Visible work, not invisible knowledge. Frank continued. People don't pay me because I turn a wrench. He pointed toward the photographs. They pay me because I spent 40 years learning which wrench to turn. Richard stared at the floor. Every arrogant comment he'd made replayed in his mind. Every dismissive laugh. Every assumption. And for the first time in years, he felt ashamed. Not because he had made a business mistake. Because he had failed as a human being. That realization changed everything. The next day, Frank visited the factory. Again, he studied the machine. Again, he identified a problem nobody else could find. Again, production resumed. But this time, when he submitted his invoice, Richard didn't hesitate. He paid it immediately. Then he did something nobody expected. In front of hundreds of employees, Richard stepped onto a platform overlooking the production floor. He called Frank forward. The workers gathered. The room fell silent. Richard took the microphone. "I owe this man an apology." Whispers spread through the crowd. The CEO continued. "A few months ago, I judged his value by the amount of time I saw him working." He paused. "And I was wrong." The room remained silent. Richard looked at Frank. This company nearly learned a very expensive lesson. He turned toward the employees. "Every person here possesses knowledge that took years to develop. Experience has value. Skill has value. Wisdom has value." His voice softened. "And respect should never depend on job titles." Many employees felt emotional hearing those words, because for years they had felt overlooked, ignored, undervalued. Now their CEO finally understood. But the story didn't end there. The experience transformed Richard in ways nobody expected. Over the following year, Titan Dynamics changed its culture. Employee suggestions were taken seriously. Veteran workers were respected as mentors. Training programs expanded. Management listened more carefully. Productivity improved. Employee satisfaction increased. Turnover decreased. The company became stronger than ever, not because of new technology, not because of better equipment, because people finally felt valued. And when people feel valued, they give their best. Years later, Richard often shared Frank's story during leadership conferences. Whenever audiences asked about the most important business lesson he'd ever learned, he told them the same thing. Never confuse simplicity with lack of value. He would pause, then smile. The person who solves your biggest problem may not look important. They may not wear an expensive suit. They may not have a fancy title. Then he'd add, but respect them anyway. Because wisdom often arrives wearing work boots. The greatest expertise is frequently invisible, and the people who know the most rarely need to announce it. As for Frank Miller, he never became famous. He never appeared on magazine covers. He never chased recognition. He simply continued helping people solve problems. One engine at a time. One factory at a time. One lesson at a time. And perhaps that's what made him extraordinary. He understood something many people spend their entire lives learning. Your value isn't determined by how long a task takes. It's determined by everything you learned before the task began. The world often celebrates visible effort, but true mastery lives beneath the surface, hidden inside years of practice, failure, persistence, and sacrifice. So the next time you see someone accomplish something in minutes, remember this story. You didn't witness the minutes. You witnessed the decades behind them. And if you're someone whose skills are overlooked, whose experience is underestimated, whose knowledge goes unnoticed, don't lose heart. Keep learning. Keep growing. Keep showing up. Because one day, the very thing people dismiss may become the thing they desperately need. And when that day comes, remember your worth. Not with arrogance, not with pride, but with quiet confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where to place the mark. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And remember, the world may see a 5-minute solution, but never forget the lifetime it took to create it.